Hey everybody, welcome to the first day of class on your own for geography. We just have a couple things we want to talk about today. Um, the first thing we want to talk about is we want to talk about this interaction of five factors that are going to keep coming up in this class. In fact, it's going to be one of the main uh, points of this class is to talk about the interaction of these five elements and how they are all impacting each other all the time. Often we sort of study economics separately or politics separately or geography separately or culture separately, but actually they're all impacting each other all the time. And so one of the things, like if you're an international studies major, one of the things I really want you to get out of this class and thinking about the major is that it takes a lot of different perspectives to think about just one thing. For example, if you want to study a particular country or a particular group of people, or you want to solve a particular issue, you have to understand how all of these different elements impact each other. Maybe even different systems impact one another. So you can really be effective at what you're doing and really understand what's happening. Like, here's the thing. I get that not everybody likes economics, not everybody likes politics. That's fine. I, I don't like grading, but to be a professor, which I really do like, I have to grade. So it's part of the thing of you still have to sort of, even if you don't want to dive into it, you still want to understand these elements so you can do the things you want to do then, and sort of meet the passions that you want to meet. All right. Pause this if you want to write this down. I'm going to move on. Okay, I'm moving. So I just want to break down those five categories very quickly, just so we know what we're talking about. Because what we're going to start doing is we're going to start going around to different regions of the world. We're going to start in Europe, then we're going to go to Russia, then we're going to go to Australia and Oceania. And essentially when we go to each of these places, we're going to look at how all of these things interact with each other. Now, we're going to sort of dive into some countries. We're going to do broad visions of some other things, but all these things are going to be in place. So I want you to remember these things as we go through. And these are the sort of the elements. If you want to sort of have a way to begin thinking about something, try to answer these questions about a particular place and people and see how they interact with each other. And we'll see if we can find patterns as we're going through this. All right, so the first we want to talk about is the physical environment. So like what's going on there. So here are just four things, and this is not exhaustive at all, but just four things. If you start here and answer these questions, or sort of get the idea of what these characteristics are, you have a pretty good idea of what's going on. The first is climate. And the reason why climate matters is for obvious reasons that we talked about on Wednesday. Food. Different kinds of climate are going to make food easier, harder to grow, different types of food to grow. So climate's going to matter quite a bit, obviously. Here's another one. Not very sexy, but soil. Soil and soil erosion. I don't exactly need you to go dive into the dirt wherever you end up somewhere, but you should understand like what's going on with the ground itself. Again, this is related to food and a whole bunch of other things. What are the landforms? The landforms have an effect on the climate. For example, if there's mountains, is there an ocean? What's the river? Are the rivers rolling through? These are sort of things that matter to all that as well. And one more thing I would add to that, and that's the natural resources availability. Does this place have natural resources, or is it pretty devoid of it? What resources does it have, and how does that impact other things? All right, so that's physical environment, kind of an easy one, I guess you could say, just in terms of, just get on your Wikipedia and you got to know what's going on there. The next one we want to talk about is trickier, and that's because, well, you'll see here in a second, that's culture. So just take a second here, and I want you to try and define for yourself what is culture. In fact, you might even pause it right here and just write down one sentence. What do you think a good working definition of the word culture is? I'm pausing so you can pause. Okay, so I assume you paused. Here's what I have, and it's not a perfect definition, but it's a good starting spot. Shared way of life. And so that can be things like language, religion, norms. We haven't talked about norms yet, but we will. But things that are sort of normal practices. And some other things to that effect. I mean, this is clearly, again, language and religion and norms is not really exhaustive, but it is sort of this idea of what we all think is, or what we all sort of do together as a group that might be different than a different group. Now here's the deal. Modernity and globalization can change this significantly. When a Well, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but like when a Walmart moves into a particular neighborhood, a lot of the local mom and pops kind of go out of business. It sort of it really changes the nature of a particular neighborhood. Same thing happens at the global level. The more a society, a group gets engaged into sort of the globalization, the more things change. And you're going to see that when you do the reindeer readings here in just a little bit. And I want you to think about this. Like, I want you to sort of figure out, like, what's the culture of these reindeer herders? But I also want you to think, okay, so as globalization is impacting them more, whether it's through climate change or whether it's through just sort of they are becoming more integrated with the society to the south, how does that change their culture? How does that change a bunch of the other things that we're going to look at as well? And then a culture's survival depends in part on food. This is one of those sad things about history, is that if we look around the world today, we see tons of different cultures, and it's pretty amazing. You can, especially with the internet, you can dive into these different cultures. But that kind of covers up the fact that throughout human history, think of all the variety of cultures, the thousands and thousands and thousands of different cultures that didn't survive till today. They just, for whatever reasons, whether because of war, whether because of famine or whatever, food becomes a very important part of this. If you don't have food, your society's not going to last very long. The societies that have lasted till today have lasted because they've been able to eat. I know that seems like a weird thing, but all these things are interacting with each other. All right. So again, the next thing we want to talk about is political and social organization. I'm a political scientist. That's one of the main things that's what I got my PhD in. I find this stuff fascinating. I know not everybody does. I'm not asking you to find it fascinating, but what I am asking you to do is to understand it so you know how it impacts things like culture, which you may find fascinating. So one of the main organizational things out there in the world right now is the nation state. That's how everything is organized at the international, at the global level. Every human being, with a few exceptions, but we're just going to asterisk there and come back to that later in forever. But every human being belongs to a state. That's how you sort of are identified in the world, is your citizenship to a state. That's just how the world works now. So there's this allegiance to this thing called the nation over other groups. Like, for example, I'm trying to think of a good thing. It's not tribes. It's not family so much. It is the nation is the thing that's sort of the organizing thing. And then there's this loyal to a larger political institution, and that's called the state. In fact, what we call these things, you guys might call them countries. Sometimes you've heard them called states, though then you start getting confused with states like Montana versus states like France. But what the term actually is what's called nation state. This idea that every state has a nation and every nation has a state. We're going to talk more about this throughout sort of the next years, but this is sort of the place to begin, is that this is how humans are organized today. They're organized into teams, and these teams are essentially nation states. Now, whether these teams are competitive or cooperative, we're going to get to that later. But another thing is the use of borders. That essentially, here is San Diego, and here's Mexico. Let's make this the U.S. there. If I'm standing right here, and then I take 2 steps across the border, there's a very different set of rules here than there are here. And there's just this thing called the border. Why use borders at all? Why are borders an essential part of this whole thing? That's going to come up. Think about that as we go. Is anyone outside of a nation state? The answer is yes, not many, but this creates a real problem in the world. We'll get back to that later. One more thing, just if you want to simplify this a little bit, once you got that sort of gist down, to simplify this, we sometimes just, one of the main things we use to distinguish political social organizations from one another is just a real simple thing. It's not perfect, but it's a good starting point, and that is to talk about what type of government there is. Democracy, autocracy tend to be the main ways we break this down. You might call autocracy dictatorship as well. And then there's a whole bunch of things in between. I mean, nothing's really perfect on that, but that's a good starting point to sort of distinguish 2 places from one another. We're going to get to that with Russia pretty soon, so hold on that. The next factor here is economic organization. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit on Wednesday, is people start growing food, and the more efficient they are growing food, the more, so you're growing food and you're getting just enough for yourself to eat. We call this subsistence economy. That's called no surplus. Essentially, whatever I'm growing is enough for me to survive, subsistence. I'm just barely getting by. If anything happens to the food I'm growing this year, I'm dead because I just have enough to get by. So some societies sort of are sort of living at that very bare subsistence level. The next one up is, or the next one up, I shouldn't say, that's not exactly the right way to put this, but for now, another category is peasant economy, where essentially now I'm growing more food. I'm growing it more efficiently now, maybe not too much more efficiently, but I'm growing it more efficiently, so I take this extra food and I trade it for other stuff. So I need clothes, so I'm going to trade food for clothes and things like that. So the surplus is essentially traded. We call that a peasant economy. Do these still exist? Absolutely, they still exist. A lot of the third world is what we'd call a peasant economy. We might not use the word peasant economy, but we're definitely talking about this sort of very bare subsistence. Now, what happens when we start getting more and more surplus? How is this controlled? One is a communist socialist economy, where essentially the state controls the surplus. It determines what's grown. It determines how things are sort of given out. Now, when I say socialist here, let's not start getting confused with how it's used in the U.S. today. The U.S. has a really weird definition of socialist, so don't worry about that. For now, just think in terms of the state controls the surplus. The other one, and the one that was probably more dominant in the world today, is what we call a capitalist economy. So over history, we could talk about these different things, but today, honestly, it's largely a capitalist economy. There's just there's several places in the world where we still have this going on. Not too many where this is still going on. This is the dominant thing today. And what a capitalist economy is essentially very different than those other things. We don't tend to own land. Workers earn wages. And corporations are the things that buy and sell the surplus. So corporations are just individuals coming together to own stuff. So it's a very different sort of organization. This will not come up as much, I should just say, because a lot of the world is capitalist today. But as we talk about some places, we're going to talk about how these transitions have happened and all that. All right. So I guess what I'm trying to say so far is two of these categories we just talked about. The last one, which is political and social organization, a very simple sort of bookmark that you can just sort of say in your head is it an autocracy or is it a democracy? And that's a good starting point. There'll be more to it than that, but this is a good starting point. With economic organization, you can just sort of think, man, most of the world's capitalist, or at least striving to be capitalist. There's going to be a number of very poor areas that are going to be something more like this. This does not exist as much as you might think. Maybe North Korea, maybe a couple other places, not China. But this is going to be sort of the dominant thing. So those are pretty easy ones to sort of think about for now. If we were doing a more historical sort of version of this, we would see these things changing a lot more. All right, one more thing, and that is economic activity. This is kind of related to our economic organization, but for now we're going to keep them separate. And what we're talking about here is production mode, or a term that we're going to talk about next week called development, the level of development. And there's really kind of four categories, three of which we kind of understand, the fourth which we're making up as we're going because it's happening right now. There's the agricultural mode of production, where essentially the main thing going on in society is growing food. Or growing stuff that can be turned into other stuff. Like cotton is not food, but it's still growth. The next the next sort of mode is industrial, where essentially we're less focusing our economy on growing stuff and more focusing our economy on making stuff. As we talked about a little bit the other day, there's a lot of changes that come with this demographically, which means there's going to be a lot of changes culturally. You see how all these things are interacting. The next mode is service, where essentially, so if agriculture is we're growing stuff and industrials are making stuff, service is we're doing stuff, but that's not a good way to put it either, where essentially you might talk about tourist organization, but The United States, for example, is more of a service economy because of all the financial, banking, education stuff it does. Um, a place like, let's say, Tahiti might be a service economy because of all the tourist stuff it does. It doesn't grow stuff, it doesn't make stuff, it does service. I don't know. There's probably a better explanation of that. I don't know what it is. Now here's the fourth category that gets added sometimes is information, and that's kind of where the United States is. But we don't really know how that differs from service very easily because it's emerging, and we don't have a really good definition of this right now. So just know that we're talking about things a little bit differently, but don't worry about that for now. For now, the main things are these three. Do they focus on growing stuff? Do they focus on making stuff? Do they focus on, I guess, see other? One question we're going to ask next week is there only one path to development? Because honestly, this is where the money is. Let's say there's a lot of money here, there's pretty good money here, there's not much money here. And so often a society wants to move from here to here and from here to here. And is there only one path to do that? In other words, do I have to do this? Can I be successful at this level? I mean, there's a lot of questions that go on there. But what we do know is when we look around the world, we see some places that are developed and some places that aren't developed, and we have to ask why. I know this is going way too long. Let me just ask one more question. Just throw one more thing out there. Can we map development? So if I, for example, put a map out on the table, which showed sort of where, that's not a good way to put this. In other words, can we sort of figure out geographically, since these things are all interconnected, can we figure out geographically which places are most likely to be developed and which place is not likely to be developed? Like, what are the sort of the patterns for that? We're going to talk about this more next week. But some questions that might come up is, why did Europe develop before China? Why hasn't Africa developed? These are questions we want to ask next week. For now, you're going to go do some reindeer readings, and then we're going to come back very quickly and talk about something, and then you got a little assignment. So I will see you guys